The containment field smelled like ozone and something faintly mineral, the way a tide pool smells after you've had your hand in it too long. I noticed that first. Not the ceiling, which was curved and lit from within. Not the restraint cradle, which had released me somewhere between the hangar bay and wherever I was now. Not even the sound of the ship. A low harmonic I could feel in my back teeth more than hear, which told me we were moving but not fast, probably still inside the gravity well. I noticed the smell because I am a field researcher, and field researchers notice smells. 22 years of it, you learn to read an environment before you look at it, because looking takes time, and the environment has already been happening to you for several seconds by the time your eyes catch up. The room was approximately 4 meters by 6. The walls curved inward at the top. Everything was a pale silver gray that was not quite metal and not quite ceramic, and the ambient light had no visible source, which meant it was either diffused through the material itself or routed through a substrate I couldn't identify. The floor had a faint texture underfoot, not rough, more like the surface of a good wetsuit, and there was a single piece of furniture, if you could call it that, a low platform, body width, about 40 centimeters off the floor, with a slight concavity in the center that was clearly designed for a person to lie in. I didn't lie in it. I sat on the edge of it and looked around. There was no door I could see. There was, in the far wall, a seam that I suspected was a door. Above the seam, a device the size and rough shape of a cantaloupe was mounted flush with the ceiling, and it had 4 apertures arranged at cardinal points that I was fairly certain were sensors of some kind. 2 of them were pointed at me. I had been grabbed from my boat at about 11 in the evening, local time, off the coast of the Azores. I had been in the middle of a sonar transect. My equipment was still on the deck of the tender, probably still running. I had not been hurt. Whatever the containment field was, it had been a bright column of light, which I will grant was dramatic. It had handled me more carefully than most of the submersible winches I've worked with. I was not panicking. I want to be clear about that, not because I'm trying to sound impressive, but because panic would have been a waste of time and I knew it, the same way I know not to thrash when a current takes me. You wait, you read the environment, and you do the next useful thing. The next useful thing, I decided, was to stay still and see what the sensors did. They hummed, faintly, at a frequency just above what I'd normally call silence. The 2 apertures that had been facing me slowly, very slowly, rotated to include my feet, then my hands, then returned to my face. It was methodical, systematic. Whatever it was doing it the way a good instrument does. It was taking a baseline. I held out my left hand, palm up, and kept it steady. The 2 apertures stopped. Then a third one, which had been pointed at the wall, moved to look at my hand. "That's a data point," I said to the room in general. "You're welcome." The room did not answer. The seam in the far wall opened. The creature that came through was approximately my height, though the way it moved made it seem taller. It was bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, with 4 upper limbs instead of 2. The secondary pair folded against the thorax in a resting position. Its skin, or whatever the outer integument was, had a scale-like microstructure that I could only see because the ambient light caught it at an angle, and the scales were doing something. They were shifting color, not dramatically, not like a cuttlefish doing a full chromatic display, but there was a slow, deep blue moving through the silver gray of its chest and throat, the way cold moves through water. Blue. In my experience with bioluminescent species, blue is usually either a threat signal or a stress response. Given the context, I was inclined toward stress. It was carrying a flat panel about the size of a tablet, and it stopped 3 meters from me and looked at me for a long time. I looked back. "I'm going to guess this is a standard intake procedure," I said. "I'll try to be helpful." The scales went slightly more blue. It held the panel toward me and touched one of the 4 apertures on the ceiling. A short sequence of taps, like a command input. The panel lit. What appeared on it was clearly a biological scan in progress. I could see a schematic that was recognizably humanoid in outline, approximately my proportions, and a set of data columns running alongside it, some of which were populated and some of which showed what I could only read as placeholder values or error states, blinking indicators, fields that should have had numbers and didn't. It rotated the panel so I could see it clearly. I was not sure if this was protocol or if it was doing something instinctive, showing me the instrument the way you might show a caught animal the net, to see what it does. I leaned forward and looked at it carefully. The schematic was wrong. In 2 places I could identify immediately. The respiratory system was mapped with a single primary loop, 1 chamber in, 1 chamber out, which would have been correct for a much simpler mammal. Human respiration doesn't work that way. We have a 2-stage pulmonary circuit with a separate systemic loop, and whatever sensor was building this model was reading my chest expansion and contraction, as a single undifferentiated process because it wasn't distinguishing between the two pressure differentials. The second error was in the neural column. The instrument had mapped two distinct neural clusters, one cranial, one somewhere in the mid-torso, and seemed to be treating them as two separate systems of equivalent complexity. Humans do have an extensive enteric nervous system, which is sometimes called the second brain, and it is genuinely complex, but it is not equivalent to the central nervous system. The instrument was apparently reading it as a parallel command architecture. Both errors made sense. They were the kind of errors you make when you are calibrated for a different class of organism, and you are trying to fit new data into existing categories. I have made similar errors myself. In the field, when I've encountered a species outside my training, the instrument wasn't wrong in a fundamental way. It was wrong in the way all instruments are wrong when you haven't updated the baseline. Your respiratory model is reading my breathing as a single loop, I said. I touched the relevant section of the schematic, then looked at the creature to make sure touching the panel was acceptable. It didn't move. I took that as permission. It should be 2. I can show you where the pressure differential is if your sensor can distinguish it. I pressed my hand flat against my sternum and breathed in slowly, then out, exaggerating the expansion. The 4-aperture device above us rotated all 4 sensors toward me. The data column beside the respiratory schematic flickered. Then it changed. The single loop split into 2, and 3 new data fields populated themselves. The creature made a sound I had no reference for, short, from somewhere in its upper thorax, and stepped forward 1 pace, then stopped. The neural mapping is also off, I said, keeping my voice level. What you're reading as a second command center is more of a secondary processing node. It's complex, but it takes direction from the primary. You want the cranial cluster to be your reference. The mid-torso data will make more sense as a subsidiary once you've reframed it. I wasn't sure the translation matrix, if there was one, was making any of this intelligible, but the instrument was listening. The neural column on the schematic was already reconfiguring, shifting the weighting between the 2 clusters, and 4 of the error state fields resolved into populated values. The creature stood very still. The blue in its scales had deepened and was now moving faster, cycling through the chest plates in a pattern I hadn't seen before. The overhead device ran through what I can only describe as a verification pass, all 4 apertures sweeping me in sequence, then returning to a resting position. The schematic on the panel updated. The blinking indicators went dark. 14 data fields that had shown error states were now populated. Then the instrument stopped. Not paused. Stopped. The panel's active indicators went from green to a pale amber. The data columns froze mid-scroll. Whatever processing was happening on the back end had apparently reached something it didn't know how to categorize, because the whole system had stalled the way a good piece of software stalls when you give it an input outside its expected range. Not crashed, just waiting for a human to tell it what to do next. I had seen this before, not with alien equipment obviously, but with sonar arrays and oceanographic instruments, and once with a submersible's navigation suite that I had fed a pressure reading it did not believe because the pressure shouldn't have been physically possible at that depth. The instrument was correct, the reading was correct, the database it was checking against was out of date. The creature with the panel looked at the panel, then it looked at me. Then it looked at the panel again. Its secondary arms, the folded pair, had unfolded slightly. The joint angle suggested something like confusion or recalibration in the way that posture often does. I think your classification system may have run out of comparison points, I said. That happens. It's not a malfunction. The scales went through a color I cannot name. Not blue. Not the silver-gray baseline, something that was simultaneously both and neither, a shifting interference pattern between the two, and it happened fast, a full sweep from throat to mid-chest and back, and then settled into something slower and deeper. The creature touched the panel. A sequence of inputs I couldn't read. The amber indicators didn't change. It touched the panel again. Longer sequence. The amber indicators flickered once, then stayed amber. It looked at me. "Do you want me to keep going?" I asked. The scales did the thing again, the interference pattern, fast. I decided to take that as a yes. What other data does it need? I gestured at the panel. If there are fields it hasn't gotten to yet, I can probably help you populate them. I know my own biology reasonably well. 22 years in the field, you learn what your body is doing even when it's inconvenient. The creature did not move for approximately 4 seconds, which is a long time when 2 beings are looking at each other across 1.5 meters. Then it held the panel toward me so I could see the full schematic. There were, by my count, 6 remaining unpopulated sections. One was clearly cardiovascular. I could see a circulatory map that had the general shape right but the valve count wrong. One appeared to be immune-related, based on the cellular-looking icons clustered in a region that corresponded to lymphatic tissue. Two I couldn't identify from context. One was labeled with a symbol that repeated elsewhere on the panel and seemed to correspond to the entry I'd already corrected, and one was blank entirely. No field label, no icon, no structure, just an empty rectangle with an amber border. I pointed at the blank one first. "What's that supposed to be?" I asked. The creature tilted its head, a gesture that seemed to be cross-species, at least in this direction. It didn't have an answer. Or it had an answer, and no way to give it to me. Either way, the blank field stayed blank. "All right," I said. "Let's do the ones with actual structure." I worked through them methodically. The cardiovascular section took the longest, because the instrument had mapped the heart as a two-chambered organ, and it is not. I had to slow my breathing and hold a specific posture while the overhead sensors recalibrated, and even then the four-chamber map it produced had the left ventricle and left atrium sizing slightly off, but it was within a reasonable margin and the instrument seemed satisfied because the amber indicator on that field went green. The immune-related section resolved quickly once I showed the sensors the lymph node cluster at the base of my neck, which is accessible enough to demonstrate without any equipment. The two unidentifiable sections populated themselves partway through my work on the immune data, which suggested they were being calculated from the other fields rather than directly measured. I was familiar with that too. Derived data, the instrument inferring what it couldn't measure from what it could. Both fields went green, which left the blank one. I looked at it. The creature looked at it. The overhead device ran a slow sweep across me, returned to resting position, and ran the sweep again. The blank field stayed blank. "I genuinely don't know what you're looking for there," I said. "If you can give me any context, a reference image, a comparable field from another species intake record, I might be able to help." The creature looked at the blank field for a moment. Then it did something I had not seen it do yet. It reached up with one of its primary arms and touched the blank field directly, a slow press with 2 fingers, and held it. The field did not populate, but a new indicator appeared beside it. Not amber, not green. A pale white, and a second line of text appeared below the blank rectangle, which the creature and I both looked at, and which the creature apparently read, because the interference pattern color ran through its scales again, faster than any of the prior times. Then it ran the slow, deep color afterward, that unnameable tone between blue and silver, and it stayed there. "I'll take that as a category pending," I said. The creature lowered its arm. It looked at the panel. It looked at me. The intake schematic was almost entirely green now. 14 fields had been error state when we started. 12 were now populated and resolved. 1 was derived in green. 1 was blank with a white indicator that had no precedent in whatever filing system this vessel was using. The creature entered a long sequence on the panel, then a short one. Then it held the panel against its chest and looked at me for a long time, in a way that had stopped feeling like a predator assessing prey about 4 minutes ago, and now felt like something I recognized from fieldwork. The look of a researcher who has just measured something they are going to be thinking about for a long time. I understood that look. I had worn it myself, off the coast of the Azores, 3 months ago, when I had picked up a sonar return that the existing literature said was impossible and spent 6 hours verifying it before I let myself believe it. "I'm going to guess," I said, "that this is the part where you decide what to do with me." The scales moved in a slow, deep wave. Not the stress blue of the beginning. Something else. "I'm also going to guess," I said, "that your file doesn't have a category for a subject who helps." The creature looked at the panel. Then it looked at the ceiling. Then it looked at me, and it did something with its secondary arms. A careful, deliberate extension and return, like a shrug converted into a gesture by something that had never shrugged before but understood the concept. I didn't know what that meant in Velsarathi body language, if that was even the right name for it. But I had spent 22 years learning to read animals, and what I saw was not threat, not confusion, not the blue of stress. What I saw was something closer to the expression on a colleague's face when they've realized the problem they came to solve has turned into a more interesting problem than the one they started with. I sat back on the edge of the platform. "What's the next part of the protocol?" I asked. The white indicator beside the blank field pulsed once, very faintly. The creature held the panel up again, and this time it rotated it so I could see the full intake record, all fields, green and pending alike, and it touched the panel in a new place, a long sequence, and I watched the record scroll to the top and display a line of text in a script I couldn't read. But below it, in the derived data section, a new field had generated itself. It had not been on the panel before. The instrument had created it in the last few minutes, apparently because it had no other way to file what had happened. The field's label, in whatever script this was, I could not read. The data it contained was a single symbol I did not recognize, but the amber border around it had gone white, and then, while I watched, the white pulsed once more and held. Not green, not amber, something the panel had not produced before. The creature made the sound from its upper thorax again, the short one, and this time I thought, though I had no basis for this, only 22 years of reading organisms that couldn't tell me what they meant, that it was not a stress sound, it was something else, something that didn't have a name in its intake log either. "All right," I said. I folded my hands in my lap and waited, the way I always wait at the beginning of a long observation, settled, patient, professionally curious, and genuinely interested in what comes next. The intake record sat on the panel between us, mostly green, one field pending, one field in a color the instrument had invented for the occasion. Outside the ship, somewhere far below, my sonar transect was probably still running, sending its careful pulses into the dark water, waiting for a return.